This subject is interesting at the moment. Obviously, we will have all heard about the terrible things that happened in Israel about a fortnight ago when the Hamas, a terrorist organization in Gaza, attacked civilians in southern Israel. A terrible thing. Proportionally, more Israelis died in that attack than Americans died in September 11. And so we can understand their grief and their hurt and to a degree their rage at the events that occurred a few weeks back. Look, there are no rights in this situation. It's very, very challenging and very, very troubling. And we, of course, know that God does have the answer to this situation. But in the meantime, this is a call to us to be watching, to be alert. And for those of us who have not yet committed ourselves to be a member of the family of God, a member of the family of Jesus Christ when he returns, now's the time to really be thinking about it, to be wondering what else we need to do to get to that point where we're ready to take on the name of Jesus Christ and be a member of God's family. And for the rest of us, it's a call to watch. This is not a call to go, aha, interesting, I'm going to collect newspaper articles. It's a call to be motivated to lift up our heads because our redemption draws nigh. God said he would do nothing, but he share it with his servants, the prophets. And we were told these things would happen, that terrible things would happen before his return, before the return of his son, should I say. And very interestingly and relevantly to our subject tonight, just today they've announced that 14 villages, I don't know what the right term is, along the northern border of Israel where it borders with Lebanon are being evacuated due to increasing problems across the border with Lebanon as Hezbollah, another Iranian-backed terrorist organization, continues to cause problems. And it looks like this war in Israel may end up being a war on two faces. And things could get very challenging. Tyre is actually the town closest to the border with Israel. One of the key leaders who established the organization of Hezbollah grew up in the region of Tyre. And should this war expand and become a cross-border war with Lebanon and with Hezbollah within Lebanon, you can be absolutely certain that the city of Tyre will see at close quarters the unfolding of these events. And so it's relevant to our subject tonight. It's important that we stay alert, that we be watching and be using these things to motivate ourselves to be ready for Christ's coming. All right, so into our subject. Lecture style, the claim of the Bible. What does the Bible claim? Well, the Bible claims that prophecy is not a human invention. I've chosen the New English Translation because I think it really adds something for us here. We do well if we recognize this important and salient point that no prophecy ever is just dreamed up by a prophet. It's not what they thought up and thought they might write down. No prophecy ever came from a human impulse. Rather, men who were carried along. The Greek word here means driven. It's actually exactly the same word that was used to describe the ship in which the Apostle Paul was blown by the great storm Euroclide and driven as if by a storm when God speaks to them. And so God was heard by the prophets, the God of heaven and earth. And again, the Bible claims that it not only knows the future, but that God makes the future happen. God knows the future because he imposes his will on future events. He does this for individuals. In the Psalms, it talks about God knows when we sit down and when we rise up. He knows the words that come into our mind even before we speak them. And God's knowledge is too wonderful for the psalmist. And when it comes to nations, he predicts their future too. He's of old, and yet he knows the future. There is no other God like this one who said from ancient times, this is what will happen. And it's exactly what happened because God makes it happen. That's what the Bible says. But if you're someone who doubts or doesn't believe the Bible, this is a really bold claim. And the real question is, can this be proven? Can we prove that God wrote the Bible and that he knows the future? Well, Many of us will have sat through lots of lectures over the years on Tyre. You may well have seen this picture before. Anyone here seen this picture before? Oh, great. 3 people. Excellent. 3 of you have been paying attention to lectures. The rest of you fast asleep for every Tyre lecture you've ever seen. Well done, James. This gentleman in his pajamas is casting his nets upon Tyre. It was taken about 1910. And for decades, this picture has been used as a key piece of evidence for the existence of God, and that prophecy has been proven to be fulfilled. Sometimes this photo is the centerpiece of a Bible prophecy lecture on Tyre. And it's used to show that God's will is perfectly fulfilled because, well, the prophecy we just read in Ezekiel 26 said that Tyre would become a place for the casting of nets and for fishermen. And here we see a ruined city. It's columns lying in the water, and there's a fisherman in his pajamas preparing his nets for the following day. And this looks like a perfect fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And obviously, the taker of the photo thought so too. Ruins of ancient Tyre, wonderful fulfillment of prophecy in Phoenicia in Palestine, they said, before the establishment of Israel at the turn of the century. Amazing stuff. So for hundreds of years now, Bible skeptics, on the other hand, have doubted the Bible. They've worked to prove that there is no God and that the Bible did not predict the future. And in the recent past, a number of prominent skeptics, including ex-Christadelphians, have taken aim at the chapter we read tonight. And they see this chapter as a centerpiece of attack on the veracity of the Bible. And if we think that this image used here is a smoking gun to prove that Ezekiel 26 is conclusively fulfilled, one could understand why the skeptics might feel otherwise. You see, this photo, like we said, appears to show a man standing in the drowned ruins of all that remains of Tyre. A Tyre that Ezekiel wrote would be scraped clean like a rock and built no more. That's what it says in verse 14. Scraped clean like a rock, built no more. And the problem with this picture is that even the most rudimentary examination of something like, let me think, Google, for example, would show that had this image been taken from a different direction, we might feel slightly differently about it. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so here's a map and the T marks Tyre. We're going to jump out to Google Maps. All right, so let's zoom down. Okay, Tyre from the sea. Not much to see there. So where will we go? Let's try and ascertain where we think that man was standing. And I've made a bit of an educated guess based mainly on the hillsides in the background of that gentleman. And I think he was probably standing roughly here. You can see from Google Maps, here are the if you like, the columns lying in the sea, and the hill line behind him looks almost identical. It really doesn't matter too much for the purposes of our exercise tonight. But had the photographer bothered to turn around, I wouldn't have seen quite this. It was 1910, but that's what they would have seen. That is not a city scraped like a rock. And Ezekiel 26 says, Tyre will no more be found. You just have to type into Google Tyre and you find it. And furthermore, it said Tyre will never again be built. I don't know if you can see, but these here are multi-story hotels sprouting up in Tyre. That looks pretty built to me. And it absolutely doesn't look like the top of a rock. And so we can understand why the skeptics might have their doubts. And so the skeptics claim that Tyre was not defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. I'll show you why they think that in a minute. They claim that Tyre is not like the top of a rock. Well, we saw why they think that. Not scraped into the sea. And again, they point at the city and say, look, it's all there on top of the land, not under the sea. clearly built again. That much is obvious. And it's very, very findable. Like I said, type it in, Tyre. The first thing you're going to find is bow repairs down the road. But if you keep going, eventually you will find Tyre in Lebanon. And there it is, you've found it. And by the way, these are just a few of the more obvious things, issues that the skeptics have with this particular chapter. And so they see this as a completely failed prophecy. And they use this as one of the most powerful tools to demonstrate error in the Bible, and therefore that God most likely does not exist. The skeptic will point at, articles like this one from Britannica to undermine what we've said in lectures for a long time. Here's the article on Tyre from Britannica. That picture is in Britannica. That's my picture. But by the way, here we go. Tyre, southern Lebanon, major Phoenician port. Tyre successfully resisted in the 6th century BC siege of 13 years by Babylonian king of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar didn't take the city, says Britannica, but it eventually fell to Alexander the Great, and so on and so on and so on. And so they say, this is a failed prophecy. It's the opposite of what Ezekiel wrote. In fact, they go so far as to say that Ezekiel acknowledged that his prophecy had been proven incorrect. When he wrote the following things, we'll turn across to Ezekiel chapter 29. We can see the passage that they refer to. Now, these verses were written 16 years later on. And in Ezekiel 29, verse 17, it says, "It came to pass in the 27th year, in the first month, in the first day of the month, the word of God came unto me, saying, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, caused his army to serve a great service against Tyre." Yes, Nebuchadnezzar did come against Tyre, as Ezekiel had earlier said. But every head of Nebuchadnezzar's army was made bald, presumably from having to wear their war helmets for so long. And every shoulder was peeled because their armor was rubbing on their shoulders for 13 long years. He had no wages, nor his army, for Tyre, for the service that he served against it. And so they read this and they say, see, even Ezekiel acknowledged that this prophecy wasn't fulfilled. Here he is saying, look, sorry, it didn't quite work out the way I meant. This is the way the skeptics read Ezekiel chapter 29 and how they reflect on Ezekiel 26. Nebuchadnezzar received no reward, no wages for his long siege of Tyre. And here's a grudging recognition by Ezekiel that he wasn't a very good prophet, say the skeptics. And so what we want to do for the rest of our evening is have a closer look at this prophecy and come to a conclusion. Was Ezekiel right, or did the prophecy fail? Were his words an amazing prediction, demonstrating that Ezekiel was in fact being guided by an all-knowing God, or was he just a bloke making a bunch of educated guesses using contemporary news and events around him and getting some of them right and some of them wrong? And spoiler alert, we all know the answer to this question. But I found this prophecy really exciting because by the end of tonight, hopefully we'll all be reinvigorated by seeing that this prophecy was not an educated guess, but a series of sequential predictions about an ancient city that are still being proved to be true even today. So let's get into it. So Ezekiel wrote his prophecy. The book of Ezekiel was written, presumably started about 592 BC, give or take a year or so, when Jehoiachin was captured. In 586, in the 11th, sorry, my dating's slightly wrong there, the 5th of Jehoiachin, should I say, is in fact the year that the prophecy started. The 11th is when he wrote Ezekiel 26, and the 27th year of Ezekiel and Jehoiachin's shared captivity is when Ezekiel 29 was written. And so this was written over a period of time. And our prophecy tonight was written about Tyre. And we said, what was Tyre? Well, Ezekiel, speaking for God, writes that God is against Tyre. That's what he said in 26, verse 2. God's angry with Tyre. And you think to yourself, that's a very funny thing for someone to say. would the God who made all things, why would that God have a grudge against the city? Oh, terrible architecture. I've never liked Tyre. The architecture's rubbish. Never liked brutalism. Is that what? Oh, the street layout, awful. I've never liked the street. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would God be angry with the city? And of course, we all know that he's not angry with the physical city, is he? That's not what God's angry with. That's not what Tyre was to God. In verse 2, God provides us with a reason for his anger. It's because, well, Tyre said, aha, Jerusalem's in trouble. That's awesome for us. That's what they said. The gloating of Tyre at the news of the fall of Jerusalem was what angered God. And you see, streets and buildings don't gloat, do they? People do. And it was the people of Tyre, the Tyrians, that God was angry with. Now, history tells us that the Tyrians were Phoenicians, a famous maritime nation who inhabited modern-day Lebanon and had established a number of city-states. Each of these cities had a state around them, and so we hear of Sidon. We don't hear so much in the Bible of Byblos, but that was another one. And of course, Tyre. Each of these was city-states, a bit like, I guess, Singapore today in some ways. The Phoenician city-state of Tyre included a swath of territory both north and south of their mainland capital, cities and villages on the mainland, as well as the island fortress of Tyre. And of course, there were also numerous trading outposts across the Mediterranean Sea. Tyre was in fact the first among equals, the most significant of the Phoenician states. And in the end, Tyre, or Tyre, gave its name to Syria. Syria, the whole area of Syria, is named after Tyre itself, or Tyre. Interesting point. God gives us further definition of Tyre in chapter 27, verse 3. He says there that Tyre, you are situate at the entry of the sea. Thou art a merchant of the people for many islands. See, it's not about a city. It's not about a building. It's about this merchant organization. They were a merchant for many islands, for many people. Verse 4, your borders are in the seas. They didn't have the same sorts of land borders as other nations typically had. They were much more interested in their maritime borders. Very interested in those. And so Tyre's most important assets related to its marine power and its maritime dominion. In fact, at this point, in the time of the Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, the others, they had the most powerful navies in the world, and the land-based powers would ally with these nations to take advantage of their navies. And here's where the Phoenicians had ended up. And see that established colonies all around the Mediterranean. They weren't worried about going inland. That wasn't important to them. What was important to them was the sea and the coasts. And so God announces his fury to the inhabitants of the Tyrian kingdom. It's a kingdom. It's not a city. It's a kingdom. His displeasure is at these people's gleeful response to the fall of Jerusalem. And so he says in verse 3, therefore thus says the Lord God, I'm against you, Tyre. I will cause many nations to come up against you as the sea causes his waves to come up. As the sea causes his waves to come up. Now that's really interesting. See, verse 3 to 6 is kind of like a summary of all that God is going to do to Tyre, of all the commands of God for Tyre's future. God declares he has called on many nations to attack Tyre. And he uses a marine or a maritime metaphor to describe these nations crashing like wave after wave after wave against the seawall of the city. You know, the relentless crashing of waves against the walls of the city would have a lot of meaning for the Tyrians. They were a naval power. They would go to sleep with that slap, 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 slap sound of waves crashing against their walls. But you see, in these words, God described not just one attack, but many, very many attacks. And this detail is so important. So important. God never promised that a single attack would forever eclipse Tyre, but rather that the relentless impact of repeated attacks year after year would destroy Tyre's walls and would level her towers, not once, but again and again and again. The city would be leveled, its inhabitants would be slain, its prominence would be diminished, the city would be demoted from being a world capital to a fishing village, its wealth dispersed to the nations, not once, but over and over. And you know, this is what history records for Tyre. Many nations came against Tyre. You can see in verse 4, it begins with, and they. That's a plural. If you've got a pencil, colour in that they. And while you're at it, jump from verse 4 to verse 12 and colour in the theys there, because it'll help you put this chapter together at another time. They would come against Tyre. And have a look at this. This is who's invaded Tyre over the years. Yes, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus the Great captured it, Evagorius, Prince of Cyprus, captured it, of course Alexander the Great, Antigonus, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies more times than could be counted, Pescennius Niger, Costro II, Rashidun Caliphate. The revolt of Tyre meant that the Fatimids got it, and it goes on and on and on and on. Like waves of the sea crashing against this unfortunate city. So when we break down this chapter, what we've got is we've got the first two verses in which God says, this is my grievance. This is what upsets me about Tyre. Verse 3 to 6 is a bit of a summary saying, these are the things I'm going to do. I'll just collect them all together into bullet points for you so you understand what I'm going to do. Verse 7 to 11, he's going to describe the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar. And there's no question of that because he says, you'll see it, verse 7, Nebuchadnezzar, he's named King of Babylon, in case we're unsure which Nebuchadnezzar we're referring to. Oh, I think you thought you meant Nebuchadnezzar from I don't know, Kalamunda. No, different Nebuchadnezzar. This is the Babylonian one. Let's be certain about that. Verse 8, he will do this. Verse 9, he will set engines. Verse 10, his horses. It's all about this one individual Nebuchadnezzar and what he will do with his army up to the end of verse 11. And then in verse 12, we switch to the they, because now we've got the next set of many, many waves of invaders coming. And then in verse 13 and 14, that should be 13 and 14, not 13 and 12. We're not reading in reverse like a Hebrew would here. It changes again. The pronoun becomes I. And there's a reason for that. And then from 15 to 21, we're going to see the response of the nations and what God does after that. So in verse 7, the prophecy becomes more specific. It talks about Nebuchadnezzar. And this is not particularly impressive, by the way. I mean, if you think about it, Nebuchadnezzar, at the time that Ezekiel wrote, was the most powerful king in the region, and had been expanding his empire in all directions. It didn't take a genius to realize that. It was only a matter of time before Nebuchadnezzar cast his hungry eyes upon the wealth of Tyre and thought, yeah, I'll have that one too. You didn't have to be a genius to realize that Nebuchadnezzar was going to try and take on Tyre, and then it would be a flip of the coin. Was he going to get Tyre or was he not? It could have been an educated guess. But you see, history records that Nebuchadnezzar did invade Tyre, and it leaves us little doubt that he took the provinces of Tyre. As it says in verse 8, he shall slay with the sword the daughters in the field. The daughters of Tyre were the villages and the towns in the broader region of the Tyrian kingdom there that would have been defeated as Nebuchadnezzar marched in towards the city of Tyre itself. And when he arrived at Tyre, the city of Tyre. And we think, well, where was that? Well, at this point of time, the city of Tyre was upon the mainland. Tyre on the mainland. Later on, it would be called Paleo Tyre or Old Tyre. And when he arrived, he found a well-fortified city on the mainland, and some distance from shore, almost a kilometre offshore, was an island fortress. Now, Herodotus, the 5th century historian and fantasy writer, tells us that as Nebuchadnezzar was using a hired navy to block the island fortress, he was able to take on the besieged mainland city without any concern about a sort of re-attack, if you like, from the island fortress. And so he besieged Old Tyre. And it turns out it was incredibly hard work. It was a hard nut for Nebuchadnezzar to crack. It took him 13 long years for his land-based army. And as we read through, we can see it's land-based. Chariots do extremely badly in naval warfare. Much the same as cars do bad on boating trips. Try it out sometime if you're not sure I'm right. And so here we're told that he's got chariots and horses and soldiers, and eventually, says Ezekiel, they'll take the mainland city. And it seems that, Britannica notwithstanding, he did take the mainland city. And I'll show you why we think that in a moment. I think Britannica is wrong. And not only that, the fortress surrendered to him. The island of Tyre surrendered. And with it, all that was left of the Tyrian kingdom. Now, let me show you why I think this. Now, this is just one among a number of reasons. So some of you at the back, I know you're a bit too far away to read the cuneiform. I would have liked to expand it so you could read it for yourselves. But you guys at the front, you can check what I've said here, that this is exactly what's up on the screen. So this is from Nebuchadnezzar's Prism, otherwise known as the Hofkalender. I'm not quite sure why it's known as the Hofkalender, but that's a cool name. If any of you plan to have children in the near future, Hofkalender. It was found in Babylon and taken to Istanbul. In fact, there's 2 copies of it. One of them is in the British Museum. The other one is in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. And in it, there is a list that describes the kings and the officials who received pensions in Babylon from the Babylonian treasury, if you like. And among them was the king of Tyre. Now, this is Nebuchadnezzar's prism. It's not someone else's. Nebuchadnezzar had this written down. And he records how the king of Tyre lived in Babylon on a pension from him, which kind of tells you that he captured the king of Babylon. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar won. And in fact, when we look at the other pieces of the historical information that we've got, it appears that what happened is that when Nebuchadnezzar finally managed to break down the walls of mainland Tyre, to use his battering rams and the like to get into that city, the king of Tyre immediately became subject to Nebuchadnezzar. It actually looks even more like the king of Tyre, on the day that Nebuchadnezzar invaded, died in the invasion. His name was Ithobal III, the same name as the father of Jezebel. Just the father of Jezebel was, I think, the second, if I remember correctly. This one's the third. And it appears that he died in exactly the same year as Nebuchadnezzar's invasion and siege was completed, which is an odd coincidence unless it just so happens that he died in the siege. And he was replaced immediately by his son, who history records as having the name of Baal. And this Baal is no doubt the pension king that is described here in Nebuchadnezzar's prism. However, within 10 years of these events, of the fall of Tyre to Nebuchadnezzar, the Tyrians decided that they would dispense with kings altogether. I mean, it's pretty hard having a king when your king's over in Babylon and you've got to write a letter saying, "What are your orders, sire?" And so they dispensed with them altogether, and they set up some people called the Shoftim, or the judges. That's a term we actually know quite well. The judges for a little over 10 years. Now, they didn't do very well. There were so many of them in such a short period of time that fairly soon the Tyrians decided they were sick of that and they wanted their kings back. And so 10 or so years later on down the track, the Tyrian population overthrew the Shoftim, and Josephus informs us that they had to send away to Babylon to get their king back, which again helps us confirm that Nebuchadnezzar was keeping them in his king bank in Babylon. And so here's the record from Josephus where he talks about that. He's referring to a previous historian. He says, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Tyre for 13 years in the days of Ithbaal, their king. After him reigned Baal 10 years. After him the judges appointed who judged the people, a list of judges who didn't judge for very long. After the last judge's death, they fetched Maribalus from Babylon, who reigned 4 years. After his death, they sent for his brother Hiram, who reigned 20 years. Under his reign in the time of Cyrus, and off they went. The kings were back on the throne of Tyre. And so all of this helps us understand that Britannicus got it wrong. In fact, the history is pretty clear that the kings were deposed by Nebuchadnezzar, did end up as hostages in Babylon, and therefore Tyre did fall to Nebuchadnezzar, no matter what the skeptics would like to think. And there's one little intriguing detail hidden in the text here in verse 11, where God said that Tyre's strong garrisons will go down to the ground. Now, the word here for garrison is the word matsiba, and it means a thing stationed. And if you look it up in Strong's, you'll find that it's only ever translated garrison in this verse. In every other verse in the Bible, it's translated idol or pillar, except in this one verse. And Herodotus, when he came through a few years later on, about 100 years later on, and visited Tyre, dropped by and he said, moreover, wishing to get clear information about this matter where it was possible so to do, I took a ship for Tyre and Phoenicia, where I learned by inquiry there was a holy temple of Heracles, or Hercules. There I saw that temple richly equipped with many other offerings, besides, and this is the thing, 2 pillars. That's our word garrisons, 2 garrisons. One of refined gold and one of emerald, a great pillar that shone at night. And doubtless as Nebuchadnezzar came through and decided he would show them what he thought of their gods and their powers, he tipped those pillars over, which the Tyrians later on propped back up again so that Herodotus and the other tourists who came through would continue to pay their tourist dollars. So, Nebuchadnezzar did fulfill the part of the prophecy described of him. He was a northern invader. He did attack Tyre with horses and chariots. The naval battle was conducted by someone who was not part of Nebuchadnezzar's army, a hired mercenary force. He slew the daughters of Tyre in the field. Tyre's villages and towns were doubtless devastated as he came through. He breached the city of Tyre on the mainland, killed many of the inhabitants, and left the old city in ruins, and in the process captured its king. And then the Babylonians were replaced by the Persians, weren't they? Now, the section describing the work of Nebuchadnezzar ends in verse 11, and you'll notice the pronouns change, as we said. It changes to they. And the first things that they do is they make a spoil of Tyre's riches. They make prey of her merchandise. Well, the first thing that the Persians did was spoil the Phoenicians. You see, the Persians just kind of inherited Tyre from the Babylonians. And what they immediately did was co-opted the naval power of the Phoenician army. They said, well, you guys are ours, and most importantly, we want your navy because, we're a land-based power, we're not really good at ships, so we want you to do that bit for us. And they went so far as to tell the Tyrians that they wanted to use the Tyrian ships to invade Tyrian colonies and take the treasure from Tyre to give to Cyrus, which the Tyrians weren't that happy about. They did manage not to make some of those invasions, but they were pillaged by Cyrus and by the following Persian rulers. Their wealth was severely curtailed, and the Persians made prey of the merchandise of the Phoenicians by demanding control of their navies. And so during this period, Tyre languished. Its ability to trade was hampered by its obligations to the Persian Empire, and its wealth was taxed away as a tribute-paying vassal of a great empire. But of course, worse was to come. Because, you see, that's not all that they were going to do. When we look on in verse 12, that they were going to do something else too. Soon that they would destroy their pleasant houses, that they would lay their stones down. And in 336 BC, a young Macedonian prince by the name of Alex began unifying Greece into a fighting force to take on the great empire of the time, the Persians. Now, we know what he did. He first of all marched out of Macedonia and across the Hellespont, and he took on an army of Persian satraps, which means provincial rulers or generals. Having defeated Sardis, he met them, I think it was Granicus was the first battle there, up near the Hellespont, and then marching on down south and across the Taurus Mountains and into northern Syria, he met Darius III on the battlefields in November 333 BC. Darius, at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, performed rather badly. He had some great strategies, but things didn't go his way. And unfortunately, Darius had made a critical mistake. He'd brought his family along for a holiday while he was fighting this war. He thought, this would be a great time for the family to get out. And Alexander just happened to capture his wife, his two daughters, and his mother, which, that's not a good place to be when you're running an empire and someone else has got your mother. And so he had to sue for peace in order to get his mother and his daughters and his wife back. And he succeeded mostly. Unfortunately, Alexander kept hold of one of his daughters and ended up marrying her. But anyway, Darius promptly sues for peace after the Battle of Issus. It's not the end of the Persians, but nonetheless, at this point, Alexander casts his eyes elsewhere. He's heading for Egypt, and on his way, he decides to take on Tyre. He'd heard that there was a temple of Hercules at Tyre, and he believed himself to be a descendant of Tyre and of Hercules, and just as handsome as Hercules, so he wanted to visit the temple of Hercules. Now, the temple of Hercules, after the defeat by Nebuchadnezzar of Tyre on the mainland, had been moved across onto the island. And so now the main temple of Hercules was on the island with all of its good stuff. But the tourist temple of Hercules was on the mainland. And the Tyrians, realizing that having Alexander show up on their doorstep and then come in to visit the temple of Hercules would not be a good thing because he'd probably capture them, said, you're welcome to come, but we want you to come to the mainland one, the tourist one. And he said, well, look, I'm a direct relative of Hercules. If you won't let me see his actual temple, I'm going to invade, which he promptly did. And so there were other reasons. The Phoenicians were still allied to the Persians, and their navy was still fighting on behalf of the Persians. And so it was really important to Alexander to stop that happening. And so Alexander began the famous, siege of Tyre. Now, Quintus Curtius, writing in the 1st century AD, writes this: there were plenty of great stones at hand of the ruins of the old city where Tyre stood before. And you think, well, why is that important? Well, you see, Alexander immediately realized, again, the same point, that chariots and horses and those sorts of things are not really good for naval battles. But now his problem was, unlike Nebuchadnezzar, where the biggest city was on the mainland, now the biggest city is on an island that is separated from the mainland by about 1 kilometre of water, just under about 800 metres of water. A deep, fast-moving channel. And he knew that his land-based army wasn't much chop in those sort of waters. And so he decided, well, if I can't find one way to get there, I'll find another way. I'll bring the land to Tyre. And so he decided to build what's called a mole or a pier or a jetty all the way out from the land out to the island of Tyre. And he needed materials to build this vast sort of road out into the sea. And there were plenty of great stones at hand. They were the ruins of Tyre on the mainland that had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar many years before. And so he began, legend has it, Alexander himself picked up the first piece of rubble and tossed it into the sea and told his soldiers to follow his example. And so off they went. They took the rubble and debris of old Tyre and cast it into the sea, just as verse 12 said would be done. And so Alexander began his 7-month siege. Now, this was not an easy battle or easy siege, should I say. The inhabitants of Tyre had excellent ships, and they made construction work very difficult by shooting things and pouring out boiling hot sand over the head of their enemies and the like. On one occasion, the Tyrians loaded a ship full of flammable stuff and sent it sailing down into Alexander's army and set them on fire. So there were lots of problems that they had to face, but gradually, that pier made its way out towards the city of Tyre. And eventually, it reached the city of Tyre. And Alexander signalled an attack. The first attack failed, and the Tyrians laughed at them. And Alexander, being the hot-tempered person he was, said, well, let's attack again. And in they went. And unfortunately for the Tyrians, what had happened by this point of time was the rest of the Phoenician navies had decided that they were on the wrong side and they'd flipped sides and gone on to Alexander's side. And now Alexander had a navy of his own, and he used that, the navy of Sidon, to attack Tyre from the sea while his men attacked it from the land. And, well, really it was all over bar the shouting. And so, while the records vary, it's clear that the men made a major breach in the wall and flooded into the city of Tyre 7 months after they began. These men had endured all manner of toil and suffering, from angry seas to burning sand, and having now at last made their way into the city of Tyre, they were infuriated. And they went about systematically pillaging and slaughtering and desecrating and killing. The records vary in terms of how many people survived the attack, but 30,000 were sold into slavery. Somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000 were crucified on the walls. 15,000 soldiers died within the city. And by the end of the battle, by the end of Alexander's sort of mop-up period, there was not a single Tyrian left in the city. And in fact, by the end of this, Tyre was no longer Tyrian. Orosius writes in 375 that among the things Alexander did, among the horrors that Alexander subjected the world to, one of them was he uprooted Tyre. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century, writes that of the Tyrians, all except a few were cut down fighting in number more than 7,000. The king sold the women, that is Alexander, sold women and children into slavery, crucified all the men of military age. There were not less than 2,000 left, although most of the non-combatants had already been shipped away to safety. Those who remained became captives, and they were sold into slavery. Or the Sibylline Oracle, which is complete nonsense, don't go reading it, but it is useful as a historical source because it was a prophecy that was written after the fact. So what you did is you wrote down your prophecies after the events had occurred, because then they're 100% accurate. The Sibylline prophecy or oracle says that an evil conquest from behind, and Carrion shall dwell in Tyre, and Tyrians be destroyed. And so the historians believe that the entire population of Tyre was supplanted and replaced by a naval ethnic group called the Carrions from up in southern Turkey. And so Alex did exactly what the prophecy said. He broke down the walls and towers of both Tyre on the mainland and Tyre on the island. He destroyed the mansions of the Tyrians, and that's what his men did as they charged through that city, looting and pillaging. They tore down the pleasant houses or the mansions of the rich and influential. And in the process, they laid the timbers and dust of Tyre on the mainland in the midst of the sea. He completed the prophetic command up to the end of verse 12. And at this point, the city of Tyre lay in ruins, its island fortress in the hand of foreigners, the old city drowned in the sea. But God hadn't finished. Note that once again, verse 13, the pronouns change. The they, the he of the verses on Nebuchadnezzar has been replaced by the they, the waves of attackers that follow. And now God himself owns the punishment of the Tyrian state. I am going to do these things, he says. And he promised to silence their songs, to remove their joyous occasions. And doubtless over the next 200 years, life felt cheerless to these new Tyrians as they strove to survive, trapped between the warring Greek empires of the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south, who warred north and south for the next several hundred years. It's an amazing thing. You know, the Tyrians gave the Greeks their character set. They pioneered ocean travel. They explored more of the planet than any other contemporary nation. But now they begin their long slide into obscurity. And the amazing thing is, the culture of Phoenicia is completely lost to us today. There is almost no writing from Phoenicia to be found. One of the most influential kingdoms of the Bronze Age, and we can't even find its records. We can find them for the Hittites, we can find them for the Egyptians, we can find them for the Assyrians, but we can't find anything for the Phoenicians. They almost lost their history. Because God said he would remove its cultural influence on the world. It would really be hard to deny the truth of these words in verse 13, the fulfilment of them. Despite the influence of the Phoenicians before Alexander on the world stage, today little can be found of the ancient Tyrian kingdom. We don't even know what its architecture looks like. And when they dig up the Tyre to go looking for it, they can find Roman architecture, they can find Greek architecture, and they can find architecture and remnants from thousands of years earlier. But the section of time that relates to our part of history, the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Alexander, it's gone. They can't find it. They can't even find the sand of it. But God went on. He said in verse 14, I will make you like the top of a rock. Now that's an interesting thing. What does that mean? Well, God's saying that by the time I'm done, in verse 14, I will make the Tyrian state like the top of the rock. What's that mean? It means featureless. I'll make you like a cultural backwater, fit for little more than being a fishing village. And then he goes on to say, in the end, you'll be built no more. You'll be a place buried and forgotten. And by the way, there's a grim joke lurking in verse 14, because God says, I'm going to make Tyre, which means a rock, like a rock. They're different words, but there's a bit of a joke in there. And God's saying, I'm going to make a rock like a rock. He says, I'll make you like the top of a rock. I'll make the rock fortress of Tyre like the top of a lofty rock. Now, what does that mean? Well, God is not here promising to make Tyre into the top of a rock. It kind of already was one. He's promising to make it like or similar to the top of a rock. And you see, that phrase is used earlier in Ezekiel. He says here of someone else that it would cause fury to come up to take vengeance. I have set her blood on the top of a rock that it should not be covered. And you see, that's what the top of a rock means. When something's at the top of a rock, it's saying it's exposed, it's easily seen, it's undefendable. Well, that's what he was saying he would make Tyre like. He would make it exposed and barren. He's not saying there'll be nothing on it. He's saying you'll be exposed and barren and your weakness will be visible to all. It's a prominent place that everyone can see that there's nothing good there. And he would strip the Tyrian state, not city, bare. exposing her weakness and poverty to scrutiny of the world. And then he says he'd make them a place for the spreading of nets. In other words, I'll make you an obscure, unimportant backwater, a fishing hamlet. That's what I'll turn you into. First, your wealth will be taken. Next, your military security. Next, your cultural influence. And I'll leave you bare and weakened, he says, and now I'll let you slide into, well, you'll be a fishing village. And that's exactly what happened. There are many records of people over the next 2,000 years who visited Tyre and witnessed its long, slow slide into irrelevance, to weakness, and finally to obscurity. Here's one. This is M.A. Maundrell. Many of you have his book on his shelf, A Journey from Aleppo to Jerusalem at Easter, a gripping read for all. But here he says, this city, standing or standing in the sea, depending on how you read, upon a peninsula, provides at a distance something very magnificent. I love his English. But when you come to it, you find no similitude of that glory for which it was so renowned in ancient times, of which the prophet Ezekiel describes in chapters 26, 27, and 28. On the north side, it has an old Turkish and garrison castle, besides which you see nothing here but a mere babble of broken walls, pillars, vaults, etc. There being not much, there being so much as one entire house left. So he's saying there's not even a house left. Its present inhabitants are only a few poor wretches harbouring themselves in the vaults and subsisting chiefly on fishing. It's a bit tricky to read this. Who seem to have preferred being preserved in this place, but divine providence is a visible argument how God has fulfilled his work concerning Tyre. They slid into irrelevance. W. Fleming notes the greatness of Tyre and then goes on to say, from the close of the Crusaders, there's scarcely any tale to tell, for Tyre lay in utter ruins. For this period, we have the notes of pilgrims and travellers. The present petty town of Sur has arisen since the Matawalis occupied the district in 1766. Its humble story presents little difficulty, but it is connected with the Tyre of history in location and name only. Ancient Tyre, the Phoenician city of greatness, is gone. So how did God do this? I know we're slightly over time here. Bear with me. How did God achieve this slide to obscurity? Well, doubtless the relentless invasions that crashed against Tyre's aging seawalls helped. Greek generals and Roman rebels and Mohammedan zealots and crusader barons and English Tommies all took their toll on the Tyrian state. And as George Rawlinson, the historian, says in his history, that Tyre was finally reduced to insignificance by the Saracen times in the 13th century. Its trade completely collapsed and it became a rock for fishermen to spread their nets upon, end quote. But invasion was not God's only tool. You see, Tyre just happens to be located in a very geologically active area. And in the last 2,000 years, the city of Tyre has again and again been shaken, damaged, and at times completely leveled by earthquakes and tsunamis. Now, this list is not a complete list. There are probably another 40 or 50 missing from this list. And you can't get them because there are no Tyrian records. Tyre didn't have records. And so it's really hard to work out what happened in Tyre through this period from the time of Alexander on. But here's just a few of the earthquakes that devastated Tyre. There are many earthquakes and tsunamis I haven't got on this list felt by cities very near to Tyre, up and down the coast, but these are the ones we know affected Tyre. And so here's a city that was inundated by waves of invasions, but it was also devastated by literal waves and earthquakes. The city moved into obscurity. But still, God was not done. You see, he had predicted in verse 14 that it would be built no more. And in the end, he says in verse 21, you will be found no more. Not just built no more. You won't even be able to Google it anymore, he says. Well, how did that happen? How would it happen that we wouldn't even be able to find Tyre if we went looking for it? Certainly not true today. Tyre still exists. It can easily be found on any map. And while it's little more than a tourist location, a minor tourist attraction today, it exists. But see, everything else that God promised would befall Tyre has happened with startling accuracy. And we've got reason to believe that God will complete this prophecy. He will complete the final termination of Tyre's existence as well. And you see, in verse 19 or 20, God was very specific about how he would accomplish this final indignity on the Tyrian state. He says here, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, when I make you desolate like the uninhabited cities, when I bring up the deep over you and the surging waters overwhelm you, then I'll bring you down to bygone people. I'll put you with the people who died in the flood, to be with those who descend to the pit, the dead ones. I will make you live in the lower parts of the earth among the primeval ruins with those who descend to the pit." See, God was going to, I like this particular translation. It's not a particularly reliable translation, so I just made it the heading. He says, "When I turn your city into a ghost town." We know what that means. And that was what God was promising, that he would drown them and turn the city into a ghost town. Well, how's that going to happen? Because it hasn't happened yet. Have a look at this. On that side, what's that? Your left, my right. You can see a map of what Tyre would have looked like when Alexander the Great arrived. Swamp marshlands, an island of Tyre. These black dots, by the way, are where the person performing the study did core samples to go looking for what was in Tyre. Here's what Tyre looks like today. Well, that's quite different, isn't it? Now, luckily, what we can do is we can use these two maps and we can kind of scale between the two maps because they've marked the core samples on both of them. So we just match up the core samples and we can work out where they were and where everything is. Now, this is based on a series of papers, about 15 of them, by French marine archaeologists Mariner, Morhange and Carrion, published from about 1998 through to 2007. Here's one of the more recent ones. Ancient Tyre and its harbours, 5,000 years of human-environment interactions. An exciting read. Okay, so let's see what happened. You see, if we map the old island, we take the map of the old island and we match this up with where the land is today and where the buildings are today, where the city has been rebuilt and where it hasn't, we see something really interesting. So here we go. That's what it was like back in the time of Alexander. I've just drawn an orange squiggle around it just so we know where it is because I'm taking that map away, but keep the squiggle. So now you can see where the orange squiggle represents where Tyre was. And you can see where Tyre is today. Of course, this isthmus here, has been built up by sand, sort of building up around the mole or the pier that was built by Alexander the Great. So let's keep going. So that's Google Maps. We've overlaid the old island of Tyre. All right. So now what I've done is I've marked where it's built up, the areas that are built on modern Tyre. And again, we'll take one way and we'll just mark in a section. You think, well, what's that section? Well, that section there is the section of the island of Tyre that is built today. That's all of the island of Tyre that is currently built. The rest of the island of Tyre is either new or not built upon. And you might be wondering about the section that I kind of left out. You know, there's a section in here that I just kind of left out and say, well, why is that not built on? Well, that actually is a huge graveyard. Massive graveyard, which to me seems like more fulfillment of the prophecy of God. So, that's how much of the ancient island of Tyre still exists and is built on today. All the rest is new land since the time of Alexander the Great, or is already fulfilling the prophecy that it would not be built on anymore. That's the biblical view. That's the unfulfilled component of Ezekiel 26. We think, well, okay, what of it? Well, then, by the way, that's just incidental. That's just interesting. The more significant factor here is, why is this the case? Why is there only a tiny fraction of the original island of Tyre that has and can be built on? And you see, the reason is that Tyre is slowly, inexorably being drowned. Now, I'm not saying the prophecy says it, so I believe it. Actually, the science says it as well. Not only is just a fraction of the old island still above sea level, but the bedrock rock on which the whole region of Tyre is sitting is measurably sinking. So here's an article taken from the aptly named Baal periodical, the Bulletin d'Archéologie et d'Architecture Libanaises, in other words, the Lebanese Bulletin of Archaeology and Architecture, and it's called The Evolution of Sea Level at Tyre During Antiquity. I think it's from 2021, fairly recent. And this study goes on to say that they explored around Tyre, and what they looked at were things like old fish tanks, bathing systems, steps up out of the water, all of the things that kind of give you a water level mark. And they noticed that from the time of Alexander the Great onwards, the sea level had risen by more than 3 meters. I thought, well, that's a bit weird, because it hasn't risen by more than 3 meters on the rest of the Mediterranean. It's only risen by 0.5 meter across the rest of the Mediterranean. Now, by the way, that's a lot, even still. So across the Mediterranean, since the time of Alexander the Great, the sea level has risen by 0.5 meter. But around Tyre, it's risen by 3 meters, and we don't have this great big lump in the water at some point. What's going on? Well, what they realized is that the land underneath Tyre itself is sinking, and they can measure it, and they can say with very good accuracy to about 30 centimeters that it is sunk by 2.5 meters since the time of Alexander the Great, and continues to do so. In geological terms, sinking by 2.5 meters over about 2,000 years, that's not a gently slipping down. That's like a lift. It's falling fast as far as geologists are concerned. And God says, I haven't finished. One day soon, the same fault line that has already drowned most of the island will finish the job. And he even tells us when. Verse 20, when I bring thee Tyre down with them that descend into the pit with the people of old time, I set thee in the low places of the earth, places of desolate of old, with them that go down to the pit. Thou shalt not be inhabited, and I shall set glory in the land of the living. You ever seen that before? We even know when. He'll set glory in the land of the living. It's an unusual phrase, that one. It's used here to strengthen the contrast. God will put glory, or better yet, beauty, in the land of the living, the very place where Tyre will no longer exist, because they won't be in the land of the living. God will sink Tyre, and Tyre will go to the land of death, and finally be lost to Google Maps. And at the same time, the same point in history, he will establish beauty, his beauty in the world. Which begs the question, what is God's beauty and when will he establish it in the world? Let's go there. These are our final few passages. Isaiah 4 verse 2. See, I think this is really exciting. This is not just a prophecy of old times. We came in here and blew the dust off. This is a prophecy of now, of our time. Young people, you'll probably see this stuff happen. Older people, it's even way better. But nonetheless, God willing, we will all be alive to see these things fulfilled. Isaiah 4 verse 2, in that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful. That's the same word. and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. It shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion after the battle of Armageddon, he that remaineth in Jerusalem, then they will be called holy, even every one that is written among the living in Jerusalem, when Yahweh shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion. Verse 5, Yahweh will create upon every dwelling place of the Mount of Zion, upon her assemblies, a cloud and smoke by day, a shining, flaming fire by night. There's the glory. There's the beauty, the Shekinah glory of God hovering above the city of Jerusalem, because the branch of beauty is present. The branch, we know this passage. Zechariah 6 says, speak unto him and says, thus speaketh Yahweh of armies, behold the man whose name is the branch. He shall grow up out of his place and he shall build the temple of Yahweh. It speaks of Jesus Christ, doesn't it? That's who the branch is. Last quote, Isaiah 11. Verse 1. Actually, let's go back one verse earlier than verse 1. Isaiah 11 begins with an and, so we're allowed to go back to the previous chapter. It says in verse 34 of chapter 10, and he shall cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon shall be felled mightily. Lebanon, where Tyre is. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots, and the Spirit of Yahweh will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear. Verse 4, he, Jesus Christ, the branch, the beautiful one, will rule with righteousness and judge the poor and reprove with equity the meek of the earth. He'll smite the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips, he'll slay the wicked and take the Tyrians down into the sea. Verse 5, righteousness will be his girdle. Verse 6, the wolf will dwell with the lamb. Verse 7, the cow and the bear shall feed. Verse 8, the sucking child will play on the hole of the ass. Verse 9, they will not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of our God. What a wonderful thing. And we look forward to that happening when all the prophecies are fulfilled and there is no more doubt in the God whom all the earth will know is the God of all the earth.